Chapter 12. Transition to New Economic Policy. Having victoriously completed the Civil War, the Soviet country began to move to peaceful economic work. In the pamphlet, On the Food Tax, written in early 1921, Lenin gave a thorough and comprehensive analysis of the country's economy at that time. He showed that there have been no fundamental changes in the Soviet economy since 1918. It was still backward and multi-layered. It consisted of 5 economic structures: a patriarchal, that is, a largely natural, peasant economy; small-scale production; private economic capitalism; state capitalism; and socialism. The leading role in the entire economy of the country belonged to the socialist system, which owned the commanding heights of the economy, but small commodity production still prevailed. The petty bourgeoisie resisted all state intervention, state control and accounting. Therefore, the struggle of the proletarian state was directed mainly against the petty bourgeois element, against speculators and private economic capitalism. It was necessary first of all to end the devastating consequences of the war and restore the economy. The country was ruined, agriculture and, to an even greater extent, the industry were in a difficult situation. There was an acute shortage of fuel. The transport was ruined. In addition, in many parts of the country in 1920 there was a crop failure. In particular, there was not enough bread, meat, fats, clothes and shoes. These shortcomings, with which people were reconciled during the war, became intolerant at the end of it. People demanded their elimination, but immediately it was impossible to improve the situation. With the transition to peaceful construction, the acuteness of economic difficulties began to be felt more strongly. Difficulties were exacerbated. The peasants grew discontent. Lenin said, in 1921, "We undoubtedly had a grudging discontent with the vast majority of the peasantry." Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XX7, p. 347. Discontent also penetrated the workers' milieu, although the best part of them selflessly struggled with difficulties, showing examples of socialist enthusiasm. Especially difficult was the spring of 1921. Due to the crop failure, the large loss of livestock and the strong decline of the peasant economy as a whole, an extremely tense political situation was created in the country. The petty bourgeois element and its vacillations made themselves felt with special force in the Kronstadt uprising, March 1921. This revolt vividly demonstrated that the counter-revolutionary elements began resorting to a new tactic of struggle against Soviet power. The White Guards, who became leaders of the Kronstadt uprising, sought to restore the power of the landowners and capitalists. They advanced the slogan formulated by the cadet Milyakov: "Soviets without communists." The White Guards tried to use the discontent of the petty bourgeois masses and, under the guise of preserving the Soviets, overthrow the Soviet regime. The departure of the revolutionary sailors to the front, the replenishment of their ranks by the raw peasant masses and the weakness of the party organization in Kronstadt facilitated the rise of the insurrection. Under the leadership of the party, the faithful sons of the country, led by Comrade Voroshilov, quickly suppressed this rebellion. A revolutionary order was restored in Kronstadt. But the mutiny in Kronstadt was not an isolated phenomenon. Along with the Kronstadt mutiny, Kulak uprisings broke out, organized by the White Guards and socialist revolutionaries in Siberia, Tambov province and other regions of the country. Desperately resisting the socialist revolution, the Kulak organized uprisings against the Soviet power, using economic difficulties and discontent among the peasant masses. In such a complex situation of class struggle, the party began to implement the transition to peaceful economic work. It was necessary to revive agriculture as a whole and thereby create the necessary conditions for the restoration of industry. The rise of industry was impossible without the broad involvement of the working class and the trade unions in this matter. During the trade union discussion, late 1920 and early 1921, The party led by Lenin and Stalin outlined a new approach to economic construction in peacetime. In the course of the discussion, fundamental questions were raised in the policy of the Soviet state: military communism, the attitude towards the peasantry and the nonpartisan mass of workers, the party's approach to the masses, in connection with the new situation, after the end of the Civil War. Opposition groups: the Trotskyites, the Workers' Opposition, the Democratic Centralists, the Bukharinites, opposed the party of Lenin and Stalin. The Trotskyites put forward the slogan of shaking up trade unions, demanded the immediate statization of trade unions, fought against the deployment of trade union democracy, and insisted on transferring military methods of coercion and command to trade unions. In the work of the latter, the Trotskyists introduced a decomposition, trying to split the working class by their policies. The Workers' Opposition, Shlyapnikov, Medvedev, Kollontai, etc., put forward a demand for transferring the management of the national economy to the All-Russian Congress of Producers. She ignored the role of the party, denied the importance of the Soviet state in the management of the national economy, and opposed trade unions to the Soviet state and the Communist Party. The Workers' Opposition considered trade unions as the highest form of organizing the working class. It took the path of anarcho-syndicalism and especially expressed the elements of the petty bourgeoisie. The group of Democratic Centralism, the Dekis, Sapronov, Drobnis, Boguslavsky, Ozinsky, V. Smirnov, etc., exerted all its efforts to undermine the unity of the Communist Party, preaching complete freedom of factions and groupings. Lenin called the Dissizhistsa, louder than all shouters, faction. Its supporters, together with the Trotskyites, tried to undermine the leading role of the party in the Soviets and trade unions. The platform of the group of Democratic Centralism was an SR Menshevik platform. Bukharin, who took along with Preobrazhensky, Serebryakov and Sokolnikov in the trade union discussion a buffer position, in fact defended and shielded the Trotskyists. The behavior of Bukharin was called by Lenin the height of the breakdown of the ideological. He said that Trotsky's and Bukharin's approach to trade unions leads to the fall of Soviet power. Lenin exposed the counter-revolutionary character of the positions of these anti-party groups. He emphasized with particular force that the continuation of the policy of military communism under the new conditions would inevitably lead to the death of Soviet power. This would certainly mean the collapse of Soviet power and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XXVI, p. 219. The party led by Lenin and Stalin sent the main blow against the Trotskyites. In their platform on trade unions, Lenin and Stalin pointed out that the trade unions are the school of communism, the school of government and economy, the mass organization of the education of the working class. This platform categorically rejected the transfer of military methods to the working environment and pointed out that all the work of trade unions should be built on the basis of the method of persuasion. Under the leadership of Lenin and Stalin, the party defeated all anti-party groups, the Trotskyites, Bukharinites, Kadupnikites and Dekists. Party organizations joined the Leninist platform. The party united around the Leninist Central Committee. In this situation, the 10th Congress of the party began. The outcome of the Civil War showed that the international bourgeoisie was unable to strangle the Soviet Republic. The enemy, who was many times stronger than us economically and militarily, we defeated and forced to give up for a long time from the war with the Soviet Union. But, on the other hand, in the capitalist countries the course of the revolution has slowed down. The economically backward and devastated young Soviet Republic had to restore its own economy and build a socialist society on its own. The transition to a new economic policy was the only correct way to solve the historical tasks of the working class. This transition was imperatively dictated by the economic and political situation in the country. The 10th Party Congress, which met in March 1921, analyzed the economic and political situation in the country and determined a turn in the economic policy of the working class. At the suggestion of Lenin, the 10th Congress adopted a plan for introducing a food tax in exchange for a food distribution. This was entirely the result of the task of strengthening the new working class and the peasantry in the new conditions, and marked a transition to a new economic policy. The food tax greatly facilitated the situation of the peasants. It was much smaller than the previous sweep. Surplus food after the implementation of the tax remained at the full disposal of the owner peasant. Thus, his personal interest was encouraged and conditions were created to increase labor productivity and further the rise of agriculture. Precisely the exact timing of the tax was established in advance. These decisions were published before the spring sowing. The ex-Congress of the party also decided on the admissibility of exchange within the local economic turnover, both through cooperative organizations and through trade in markets and bazaars. At the beginning of the transition to the food tax, it was impossible to outline in advance the boundaries of local trade. It was necessary to first establish and test in practice, and then to consolidate it in the legislative order. The decree on the income tax of April 21, 1921, published in the implementation of the decisions of the 10th Party Congress, the food tax for 1921-22 was set at 240 million poods of cereals against 423 million poods, which were to be collected in 1920-21 by a surplus stocking. The decree of May 24, 1921 established that the right of exchange, purchase and sale also applies to products and articles of artisan and small industry. Collection of legal orders and orders of 1921, number 40, art. 212. As for products manufactured by state-owned enterprises, it should not come directly to the market, but to the Commodity Exchange Fund of the state. The Commodity Exchange Fund of the RSFSR, was said in the decree, is administered by the People's Commissariat of Food and is exchanged for them primarily through cooperative organizations, and also in individual cases through individuals acting on commission basis, each time with the bringing to the attention of the All-Russian Central Union Consumer Societies, according to the contract concluded with them by the People's Commissariat of Food (IBID). Lenin pointed out that the proletarian state, allowing a certain freedom of trade, can itself, based on its political and economic power, establish the limits of this turnover. In the summer of 1921, as experience gained, it became clear that it was necessary to go further along the path of the development of trade turnover. Local trade turnover turned out to be inadequate, or, as Lenin said, commodity exchange broke. It broke in the sense that it resulted in a sale purchase. Lenin, SOCH, VXX7, p. 68. It was necessary from the local turnover to switch to free trade under state regulation. The boundaries previously established for trade expanded. And what did freedom of trade mean? Freedom of trade meant for the first time some revival of capitalism in the country, but with the preservation of the commanding heights of the national economy in the hands of the proletarian state. At the 10th Party Congress, Lenin said that freedom of trade inevitably generates capitalist elements. The question arose, is it possible to restore freedom of trade and, to a certain extent, allow the development of capitalism without undermining, at the same time, the basis of the political domination of the working class? You can, said Lenin, for the question is in measure. If we were able to get at least a small number of goods and keep them in the hands of the state, in the hands of the proletariat with political power, they could put these commodities into circulation. We would, as a state, add to our political power economic power. IBID, Volume XXVI, p. 241. With the development of the new economic policy, Lenin more and more resolutely raised the question of the freedom of trade for the peasant on the basis of state regulation. Lenin believed that some revival of capitalism is not terrible for the proletarian state, for the working class holds land, large industry, railway and water transport, banks and other commanding heights of the national economy in its hands. In terms of speech at the Fourth Congress of the Comintern, Lenin wrote, "What is the plan or idea or the essence of NEP? A. The preservation of land in the hands of the state. Also all the commanding heights in the field of means of production, transport, etc. Freedom of trade in small-scale production. 6. State capitalism in the sense of attracting private capital and concessions in mixed societies." IBID, VXX7, p. 338. Soviet power possessed all the necessary conditions for the economic satisfaction of the needs of the peasantry through the market and to strengthen the economic link between the socialist city and the countryside. Only on this basis the leading role of socialist industry in relation to the small peasant village could grow. Only on this basis could the national economy be reconstructed on a socialist basis. The introduction of NEP in all its acuteness raised the question of who would win in economic construction, socialism or capitalism. The transition to a new economic policy did not change the essence of the proletarian state, but only strengthened the political and economic power of the working class. The fundamental tasks of the economic policy of the working class, stemming from the nature of the proletarian state, remained unshakable. Only the forms and methods of socialist construction have changed. The main provisions of NEP were developed by Lenin. Further development of Lenin's teaching on the new economic policy we owe to Comrade Stalin. NEP, said Comrade Stalin, is a special policy of the proletarian state, designed to admit capitalism, with commanding heights in the hands of the proletarian state, designed to fight elements of the capitalist and socialist, calculated to increase the role of the socialist elements to the detriment of capitalist elements, the victory of the socialist elements over the capitalist elements, designed to destroy the classes, to build the foundation of a socialist economy. Lenin and Stalin, collection of works to study the history of the CPSU, B. 3, 1938, p. 33. This classic definition of the essence of the new economic policy was given by Comrade Stalin at the end of 1925. The Stalinist characterization of NEP, generalizing Lenin's teaching on this issue, fully and completely upheld the historical verification. Even before the introduction of NEP, Lenin put forward the slogan, "Communism is the Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country." Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XXVI, p. 46. 3 months after the introduction of the new economic policy, at the Third Congress of the Communist International, Lenin gave a well-known formula on the material basis of socialism. The only material basis of socialism can be a large machine industry capable of reorganizing agriculture. But this general position cannot be limited. It must be concretized. The large-scale industry corresponding to the level of modern technology and the large industry capable of reorganizing agriculture is the electrification of the entire country. IBID, p. 434. He attached special importance to heavy industry. He regarded it as the main basis of socialism, ensuring the technical re-equipment of industry and other branches of the national economy. He pointed out that only the application of tractors and other machines in agriculture on a mass scale can provide a remaking of the consciousness and skills of a small farmer. The reorganization of the village on the basis of collectivism and the transformation of small proprietors into workers of a socialist society are possible only on the basis of a wide application of advanced farming techniques. At the Fourth Congress of the Comintern, Lenin, analyzing the situation of our industry, again emphasized the importance of heavy industry with special force, considering its salvation as the salvation of the Soviet country and its independence. The development of heavy industry is the main condition ensuring the economic independence of the USSR. Stressing with all its might the significance of the large and especially heavy industry, Lenin pointed out at the same time that the restoration of the national economy must begin with the rise of agriculture. It was necessary to begin with the resolution of the food and raw materials issue. It was necessary to solve the fuel issue. In the first years of the NEP, Lenin paid special attention to the development of an industry that produces products suitable for bread. This was the only correct way for the industrial revival and recovery of the country. To build the foundation of a socialist economy, which was the main task of NEP, it was necessary to create not only an advanced machine industry, but also to transform on a socialist basis a small commodity peasant economy. In this connection, the Leninist cooperative plan emerges, which is an essential part of the new economic policy. In his brilliant articles, On Cooperation, On Our Revolution, How Should We Reorganize the Workers and Peasants' Work, Less is Better, etc., Lenin repeatedly returned to the fundamental questions of socialist construction under the new economic policy. Under the plan of Lenin, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, the involvement of peasants in socialist construction must go through cooperation, through the gradual introduction into agriculture of collectivism first in the sphere of sales, and then in the production of agricultural products. The Trotskyites Zinovievites fiercely fought against the Leninist cooperative plan. Lenin, as is known, considered the role of cooperation in the Soviet country in connection with his doctrine of the possibility of the victory of socialism in one country, against which the Trotskyites fought with frenzy. In his work, on the food tax in early 1921, Lenin regarded cooperation as a form of state capitalism. However, even then, he made a sharp distinction between cooperation and private capital. At that time, Lenin wrote about cooperation. It facilitates the unification, the organization of millions of people, then the entire population is entirely, and the circumstance, in turn, is a gigantic plus from the point of view of a further transition from state capitalism to socialism. IBID, p. 336. Thus, here Lenin regards cooperation as a way of uniting millions of people and then of the entire population in the struggle for socialism. But the cooperation itself, especially at that time, was not homogeneous. Lenin pointed to the inadmissibility of identifying the cooperation of small commodity producers with labor cooperation. Workers' cooperation, which was under the leadership of the Communist Party, was then also a socialist form of economy. Its fate was entirely linked to the successes of the socialist system. Otherwise, it was the cooperation of small commodity producers that existed in the conditions of the extreme decline of socialist industry and the disruption of the economic ties of industry with small-scale peasant farming. In such an environment, the cooperation of the small proprietors, headed by bourgeois cooperators, meant, within certain limits, the growth of capitalist elements. During the Civil War, and especially in the early years of the new economic policy, there were many such facts when cooperative associations of smallholders degenerated into ordinary capitalist enterprises or when the smart capitalists simply shielded themselves with a cooperative signboard. With the restoration and growth of socialist industry, the role of cooperation has changed. It became the main means of involving the working peasantry in socialist construction. This was demonstrated with exceptional clarity and ingenious depth by Lenin in his article, On Cooperation, and further developed by Comrade Stalin. In 1926, Comrade Stalin wrote that Lenin's interpretation of cooperation in 1921 is now insufficient and exceeded history, for since then times have changed, socialist industry has developed in our country, state capitalism has not been imposed to the extent that it was desirable, and cooperation, now covering more than 12 million members, began to link up with the socialist industry. Stalin, Questions of Leninism, ed. 11th, p. 153. The point is, In what socio-economic and concrete historical situation does cooperation develop? If it develops in the conditions of the dictatorship of the working class, when the land and the decisive means of production belong to the people, when large-scale industry goes up the hill and successfully supersedes the capitalist elements, in these conditions, cooperation, combined with the growing socialist industry, becomes the main means of the socialist transformation of the village. Cooperation is one thing, taken in conjunction with state capitalism, and another matter is cooperation, taken in conjunction with the socialist industry. IBID, p. 154. Comrade Stalin showed an inextricable link between what Lenin said about cooperation in his work on the food tax in 1921, and what he wrote in his article on cooperation in January 1923, because already in 1921 Lenin said that in case of successful development of the socialist industry, cooperation will become a powerful means of struggle against capitalism. The true role of cooperation as a powerful means of socialist construction can be understood only in development, close interaction with the growing socialist industry. In his article on cooperation, Lenin stressed that thanks to the new economic policy, cooperation takes on exceptional significance. He pointed out that the working class, possessing state power and decisive means of production, should regard the cooperation of the working peasant population as its most important task. Earlier, in bourgeois society, the socialists legitimately ridiculed the utopias of cooperators plotting peacefully, without revolution to overcome capitalism with the help of cooperative associations, for it is quite obvious that as long as political power and the decisive means of production are in the hands of the bourgeoisie, capitalist production will inevitably be to dominate, and any attempts to escape or to overcome capitalism peacefully are doomed to failure. Only with the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat and with the seizure of commanding economic heights are the necessary conditions created for the building of socialism, and from that moment on, cooperation becomes a powerful lever for the socialist transformation of the national economy. In the new economic policy, the Soviet government made certain concessions to the peasant as a traitor. It was from here, Lenin said, that the gigantic significance of cooperation ensues. On the lines of this policy, the working class, relying on large-scale industry and its state power, was to achieve the general unification of the working masses of the peasantry into cooperation. This was the main means of the victory of socialism in the countryside. The cooperation under the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Lenin put it, very often coincides with socialism, or, as he wrote, the system of civilized cooperators with public ownership of the means of production, with the class victory of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie, is a system of socialism. Lenin, OP, Volume XX7, p. 394. The cooperative plan of Lenin is inextricably linked with his formulation of the question of the role of the major socialist industry in the transformation of agriculture on socialist principles. This plan is feasible only on the basis of a large industry capable of reorganizing agriculture. Lenin regarded it as an important part of the new economic policy. The new economic policy is one of the deepest and at the same time complex strategic plans of the great Lenin. In order to understand the essence of NEP, one must understand its dual nature. On the one hand, NEP meant a certain freedom of trade. On the other hand, this freedom of trade existed only within certain limits, while ensuring the regulatory role of the state in the market. On the one hand, NEP allowed the revitalization of capitalist elements at a certain stage. On the other hand, it was designed to win the socialist elements over the capitalist elements, to build the foundation of a socialist economy and destroy the classes. In the USSR, a bilateral process of simultaneous development of capitalism and socialism took place at a certain stage, and acute struggle was underway between them, on the basis of which the overcoming of the capitalist elements took place with elements of socialism. The enemies of the socialist revolution, Trotsky, Zinoviev and others, denied the dual character of NEP. Together with Austrialov and the entire bourgeois press, they, in support of the imperialists, maintained that a unilateral process of restoring capitalism was taking place in the USSR. The Bolshevik Party not only theoretically exposed all the absurdity of these enemy interpretations of the NEP, but in practice proved the complete doom of capitalism and the triumph of socialism in our country. Having embarked on the path of a new economic policy, the Soviet government set itself the task of achieving a link between the large socialist industry and the peasant economy and, with the main masses of the peasantry, to move forward, although more slowly than previously thought, but stronger, with the whole mass at its head. On this solely correct basis, Lenin foresaw in the future the enormous acceleration of the advance towards socialism. The kulak, connected with peasant farming by thousands of threads, strove to lead the village with him. The strengthening of the economic link between the working class and the peasantry dealt a crushing blow to the attempt of the kulak to lead the bulk of the peasantry. Soviet power needed to show clearly to every working peasant that the bond between the peasant economy and socialist industry was the only way out for the working masses of the peasantry, for it alone provided the rise of the peasant economy and freed it from kulak exploitation. While outlining the milestones of the new economic policy, Lenin at the same time pointed to the dangers associated with it. He posed the question, whom? The main thing in this question was the struggle of the working class for organizing the poor peasantry and the middle peasant masses and ensuring the proletarian leadership of the peasantry. In the Civil War, the working masses of the peasantry, under the guidance of the working class, went to defend the land they received as a result of the revolution, went against the landlords who, in alliance with the bourgeoisie, were trying to restore their land ownership. This war was understandable to the broad masses of the working peasantry, it was their blood work. Otherwise there was the question of the alliance of the working class with the peasantry in peaceful economic construction. In the conditions of the Civil War, the land was finally won for the peasants, the class of landowners was liquidated. The socialist revolution thus concurrently completed what was not brought to an end in the bourgeois revolution. With the end of the Civil War, the revolution developed further. An alliance of workers and peasants in economic construction was established. The economic alliance of the working class with the working masses of the peasantry was aimed at uprooting the roots of capitalism and bringing the socialist revolution to a victorious end. In his plan outline of the pamphlet on the food tax, Lenin wrote about the alliance of the working class with the peasantry. This union is against any quinquet, not that the union, the same in economic construction. First bourgeois revolution. The second the socialist revolution, Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XXVIII, p. 312. This is the fundamental difference between the military and economic union of the working class and the peasantry. During the year between the X and Xi Congresses of the party, the conduct of a new economic policy was connected with an organized retreat, during which a new run-up was being prepared. The goal, which was pursued by the retreat, was achieved quickly, within 1 year, after which a new offensive was launched, based on the NEP. The Trotskyites and other oppositionists, propagandizing the bourgeois interpretation of NEP, declared that the transition to NEP was a continuous retreat to capitalism. While giving a decisive rebuff to the Trotskyites, Comrade Stalin said, "In fact, NEP only began a retreat, but it is designed to rearrange forces during the retreat and lead an offensive." Stalin, Questions of Leninism, ed. 11th, pages 151-152. By the spring of 1921 it became clear that our economic offensive had gone too far ahead and that the necessary basis for such a profound advance was not yet assured. For 3 years, until the spring of 1921, the proletarian state pursued a policy of direct transition from capitalism to communism, without intermediary links, in addition to the market and its relations. In its attempt to pass on to the socialist foundations of production and distribution in the most abridged and rapid way, the party ran ahead and risked tearing itself away from its base. Lenin proposed a retreat, closer to his rear, to prepare a new offensive against capitalism. This was not a retreat as a result of the defeat, for the Soviet government routed the interventionists and White Guards in the Civil War. Our rear was a farm. It was necessary to tie the socialist industry to agriculture more closely and to move forward in the future, consolidating the alliance of the working class and the peasantry even more firmly. The proletarian state had to withdraw from the principle of distribution, in addition to the market, from direct state distribution of products to new methods of farming to trade on the basis of state regulation and to monetary circulation. We needed an entirely different approach to solving the tasks of socialist construction in the new situation. The revitalization of domestic trade on the basis of state regulation was put on the agenda of the day as the most important issue of economic activity. Trade became that basic link for which it was necessary to grasp tightly to master the whole chain. Without solving this problem, Lenin pointed out, we cannot create a socialist foundation. Lenin ridiculed those who did not understand the connection between communism and trade. It seems strange. Communism and trade? Something very already incoherent, awkward, distant. But if you think economically, one from the other is no further than communism from small peasant, patriarchal agriculture. Lenin, SOCH, Volume XX7, p. 82. Trade was the only possible form of economic link between small-scale peasant farming and large-scale industry. Only through the development of trade between the city and the countryside could the economic union of workers and peasants be strengthened, agriculture raised, and industry withdrawn from ruin. The enemies of the party and the Soviet government considered NEP and trade a concession to capitalism. But this was slander against the party and the working class. In fact, the Soviet government allowed in certain limits the freedom of trade in the interests of the peasantry and the strengthening of the dictatorship of the working class. The introduction of free trade was a concession, but only to the peasantry, and it was made to establish and strengthen the economic link between the working class and the peasantry.